Thank you, Karen. And as Karen indicated, welcome to Session 3 of Church History in a Hurry. Now, for the sake of those who are catching up, remember our timeline? Well, the timeline is so helpful because it divides 20 centuries into 3 simple chunks. And even if you can't remember exactly where the dividing lines are, and I gave you some good clues, it gives you the big picture. The ancient church, a time of theological definition. And I arbitrarily began the medieval period at approximately 600 AD because that was the time when one of the most influential and significant bishops of Rome, now we call them popes, ruled, Gregory I. And also at the same time, over in the Arabian Peninsula, Muhammad the Prophet was coming to a position of influence that would ultimately extend over a very significant portion of the world and even affect the outcome of the Reformation, let alone the shape of modern times. So the medieval period in our diagram here is a downward slope. It was a time of forgetting all of the biblical foundations of Christianity and replacing them with this complicated and popular patchwork of popular beliefs, mostly revolving around saints. But the key idea here, and the reason why I chose Gregory I as one of the hinge people for beginning the Middle Ages, is because of the belief that the whole foundation of Christianity was built on the idea that Peter had been given keys. Keys that allowed him to delegate the authority to open the kingdom of heaven, to, as it was understood in the medieval period, to forgive sins. This ultimately was one of the major sources of the break that we call the Protestant Reformation. Now, last time we met, we also talked about the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, which never paid much attention to the keys and certainly never acknowledged the idea that Peter had been given this special transferable privilege so that all the bishops of Rome had a privilege that even the bishop in Constantinople didn't have. They completely denied that. And of course, in the Protestant era, in the modern era, we don't particularly recognize the idea that the Bishop of Rome has this special right. In fact, I offered on our very first time together a set of alternative theories for what these keys really were. And as we see in the book of Acts, it's Peter who has the duty or opportunity or privilege to open the kingdom of heaven to the Jews at Pentecost and to the half-Jews, the Samaritans in Acts chapter 8, to the non-Jews or Gentiles, that's us mostly, in Acts chapter 10 and reiterated in Acts chapter 11. But that understanding of the keys would have been heartily booed by any medieval theologian. Well, by the time we get to the period that under discussion today, which is the centuries before and after the Reformation itself, the power of the papacy had been on a big slide for several centuries. Why? Well, going back a couple centuries, the Crusades, for the first time in history, put the ordinary man in the street, if you will, into close contact with clergy. And the clergy were found wanting. They were just as ignorant and flea-bitten and superstitious and greedy for gold and everything else as the regular folks that the Crusaders took to be, ordinary. Priests and bishops were supposed to be super spiritual, and they didn't seem that way. The Crusades also really boosted the spirit of nationalism, the idea that we German-speaking Crusaders had better stick together or else the French Crusaders will stab us in the back. And the English felt the same way, and every group began to coalesce into what we now see are nation states. Now, this was a huge detriment to the authority and power of a universal church that was seen as the sort of spiritual counterpart to the old Roman Empire. Instead of an emperor, there was the Bishop of Rome. They ruled in the same place. He lived in the same palaces, 3 of them to be exact, which will be a nice coincidence when we get to the Great Schism, the time of the 3 popes, because you could kind of have. But the prestige of the papacy took a almost mortal hit in the 14th century. And that's our first century that we're going to look at today. It's called the Great Schism, or the time of the 3 popes. And it overlaps with certain other events that served to fracture the monarchy of the church in that day. It kind of happened like this. These nation states were becoming more and more rambunctious, and as Stalin famously observed, the Pope didn't have many divisions. He only survived mostly because of playing off powerful friends. The French king at this particular time made a pitch to, let me go back a little bit. Some of the highlights of papal power, just going back a couple of centuries to kind of give you an idea of how powerful you could be without the use of armored divisions. Gregory VI, a pope whose friends called him Hildebrand, which means burning brand of hellfire, which symbolized his zeal for holiness. It sounds negative, really, but it's not. He's like the on-fire pope. Pope on fire. I like to think of him that way. And he was dead set against rooting out corruption in the church. And he was 100% in line with the idea of the power of the keys. In fact, he felt that the papacy had authority over all the kings of the earth, and that ultimate authority rested in this one thing. He could, with a single word, excommunicate a ruler. And that meant not only was that king on a one-way ticket to eternal damnation, but it meant that all of the oaths sworn to obey him by his feudal underlings were now void. They didn't have to obey, even though they'd sworn an oath of loyalty, the oath that held the medieval era together. So when he got into a dispute with the Holy Roman Emperor, over the Archbishopric of Milan, Henry, the Holy Roman Emperor, picked his man. Well, the Pope said the church should pick their men. So they elected one in Milan. Henry came in and threw out the one elected by the church, put in his own. Well, what could Gregory VII or Hildebrand do about it? Simple. He said, I excommunicate him. I release all of his vassals of their oaths of loyalty. Now, the Holy Roman Empire sounds powerful, but basically the Holy Roman Emperor was elected by the top leaders of the Germanic states, what we now call electors. And they were free to elect somebody else now. Well, the Pope Gregory VII was taking a winter journey to visit some of his fellow bishops on the other side of the Alps, and he heard that Henry was on the march coming to get him. So he took refuge in a friendly castle in the town of Knox, and he waited for the armies to show up, and he, I'm sure, anticipated his demise. But when Henry showed up, it wasn't with an army. No, he was clad in sackcloth with ashes, accompanied by his wife and young son. And his goal, Henry's goal, professed goal, was to get absolution and to publicly proclaim his penitence for what he had done. Well, the Pope said to himself, I'm sure, and maybe others, this has to be a trick. I know Henry. He would not do this in his heart. This is a trick. So he knelt along with his wife and son in the snow outside the castle the first day, and then the second day, and then the third day. And by then, everybody was saying to the Pope, you've got to forgive him. I mean, look, this can't go on. So, okay, I'll hear your confession and absolve you. Thank you very much. Well, Henry went home, whipped his nobles into line, came back with an army, invaded Rome, kicked Hildebrand off the throne, and he died in exile. So, the peak of papal power was held for a very brief period of time. Well, what happened in the 14th century to cause it to like this? Well, as I pointed out, a French king made a pitch to the Bishop of Rome saying, why should you stay in this decaying old city? Nobody to protect you. You know, at the whim of every barbarian invasion that comes to town, of course, they all want to sack Rome. And sure, popes like Bishop III stared down people like Attila the Hun, but face it, Rome is not safe. Why don't you come to this nice semi-neutral place, Avignon? It's not under the French king, although it was under, you know, a duke who was French. But it's not French, so everybody will be happy. You'll be safe. The French king will protect you. You have much more luxuries there. And so the papacy moved lock, stock, and barrel to Avignon for 70 years. And those of you who are Old Testament scholars will hear that number resonate, and they say, oh, the Babylonian captivity. When the children of Israel spent 70 years, depending on how you calculate it, in Babylon until they were finally allowed to go back to the Holy Land. Well, this could not continue because not everybody was big fans of the French. Take, for example, the English. They hated the idea of their tithes going to what amounted to a French pope. Now, the papacy in England had some rough times back in the time of Innocent III when King John, you know, the one of the Magna Carta, was on the throne. He dared to defy the papacy. Innocent III not only excommunicated King John, and King John said, I don't care, I've got my nobles in line. Little did he know. But then Innocent III put the whole kingdom under the interdict, which meant that no priest in England would do anything involving salvation. So the Mass was cut off, and it was thought that without your daily piece of the body and blood of Christ, there was no hope. There was no hearing of confessions. Nobody had a Christian funeral or buried in sacred ground. You know, the bodies were stacked like cordwood in the churchyard. There was plague. There was riot in the streets. King John was forced by his nobles to plead with Innocent to lift the interdict. And Innocent said, well, why should I? He says, well, I'll make it worth your while. I'll give you the entire nation of England as a gift, and I'll be your feudal vassal. And in fact, I'll occupy it and pay rent, 300 silver marks a year, to the papacy, just for the privilege of renting my own kingdom back. And Innocent said, okay, it's a deal. And that 300 silver marks a year was paid until the time of King Henry VIII. Well, eventually the papacy decided, for the sake of the church, and through the amazing preaching of a woman of God named Catherine of Siena, this poor old, on his last legs, Gregory XI moves the papacy back to Rome. It had been abandoned for 70 years. All of the damage you see to the Colosseum, that happened during that 70 years when shepherds and farmers needed a new pigsty. They just tear down whatever, you know, classic monument was close at hand and make their pigsty out of that. And so it was a terrible place to go back to, and Gregory died almost immediately. Well, the cardinals were there, and they said, okay, guess we should have an election. So they elected another pope. They elected an Italian pope, Urban, who proved two-faced. Before he was elected, he says, I'll bring everybody together. But as soon as he was elected, he was so unpleasant and arbitrary that the cardinals said, I demand a do-over. That was a mistake. We're all here. Let's just call that a mulligan and have another election, which they did. And they elected Clement VII. And church historians to this day They call Clement VII the anti-pope and Urban the real pope because he was elected first. So the cardinal says, we depose Urban and elect Clement. Well, it was harder to get rid of Urban than they thought. For example, he held it up in one of the castles. He had all the papal regalia. If anybody wanted to see his bishop's hat or cloak or staff or anything, he had it. He was legally elected by the cardinal, something that Hildebrand had fought very hard for. Wow. Clement, on the other hand, he was elected by the cardinals too, and he says, I am the one true pope. And he went back to Avignon. So now we had a situation where we had a pope in Rome, a pope in Avignon. And all of Europe had to divide up and say, ooh, which one are we going to send our tithes to? Which one are we going to get our bishops from, consecrated from? And it broke down along national lines. So that, the Scottish says, we'll get our bishops from whichever ones the English don't get their bishops from. And the Italians said, well, we love the Roman Pope. The French said, we love the French Pope. So the Scottish supported the French Pope and the English the Italian Pope, but not very happily. Everywhere, it was such a scandal because up to this point, there was one lodestone in the firmament of the common man, and that was salvation came through the Pope. But now the question was, which Pope? The French Pope or the Italian Pope? And people could not understand, what? There are two popes? I mean, that's like there are two sons. How can that be? And the unity of Christendom was shattered. And everybody knew that this situation could not stand, but how to solve it? Well, a number of senior bishops said there's only one way to solve this. It was the way it was done in the ancient church when they had a series of universal councils. We count 7 universal councils during the period of the ancient church. Let's have a council, and in this council will have authority to remove the 2 competing popes. Well, at this point, the 2 competing popes who could see eye to eye on nothing whatsoever turn to each other and says, bad idea! You cannot use a council to depose a pope, said the French Pope. Exactly what my brother said, says the Italian Pope. On this we stand united. No council. And so there could not be a papally approved council. But the bishops went ahead and they sponsored a council held in the town of Pisa, famous for its leaning tower. And they declared both popes deposed and elected a 3rd pope. I should bring us up to date. Named Alexander V. Oh my goodness. Problem solved. Well, you know why that didn't really solve the problem, because we had a pope in Avignon, we had a pope in Rome. Neither one would step down. And so this 3rd pope, Alexander V, moves to Rome and takes up residence in one of the 3 imperial palaces. We have 3 popes. Do you remember that famous scene from Walt Disney's Anastasia where Mickey, the sorcerer's apprentice, tries to bewitch a broom to do his chores for him, and he just gets more and more brooms? Well, it seemed like something like that was happening in the papacy. Oh, he had 1, and now we've got 2, and now we have 3. Well, once again, the solution seemed to be a council, but it'd have to be a council with teeth. They'd need some of those famous armored divisions that Stalin talked about, but you can't get them from the church. Who had them? So they got the Holy Roman Emperor to declare, along with the bishops, a council. And this time, when they decided to depose all 3, and by the way, Alexander voted for the council. Of course, the French and Italian popes once were in lockstep saying, no council! But Alexander says, council, good idea, I think we should. I bless it. No doubt he thought he would be the one man standing, but the council deposed him too. And elected a total outsider, a man named Martin. Now, no relation to, the other Martin that we're going to come to later. So this time, the Holy Roman Emperor encouraged the other claimants to the papal throne to retire for their health, if you get my drift. In other words, you retire, or we'll see if your key to the kingdom of heaven actually works. So, oh, yes, good time to retire. My pension is vested, and problem was solved. Yeah, except you cannot unring that bell. You may have one pope, but for a long period of time, you had a pope in France, you had 2 popes, you had 3 popes. And who ended the papacy? A council that was backed by the Holy Roman Emperor. Well, at the same time that the papacy was going through political upheaval, there was theological upheaval. Everyone in the church in those days, and we don't call it so much the Roman church as the church. It was the big tent under which all Christians could find a place to fit. Even if your opinions were, very Protestant in a way, or biblical, if you want to choose another term, there was a lot of toleration as long as you didn't pick publicly on some of the shibboleths of the medieval era. Well, there were a few people who started to pick at those shibboleths. These morning stars of the Reformation were rediscovering what the Reformation was going to be all about in the century before it actually happened. Peter Waldo actually lived in the 14th century, but he's such a good example. I slung him in here. He was a rich cloth merchant who achieved all of his goals, but he had a bucket list. And it was very simple. He says, all I want to do is read the Gospels with my own eyes before I die. Well, there's one little problem. Even though he was a rich, successful cloth merchant, he was illiterate. He didn't speak Latin, and he had no access to Scripture. It's difficult for us to understand how remote Scripture was to the people of the medieval era. Priests never studied it. They never read from it. There were a handful of cathedrals that had Bibles, but they were not for use. They were sacred objects, more or less. The ignorance of what was between those covers was staggering. Even though this is the 15th century, one of the great saints of the 15th century, St. Gutenberg. I'm just kidding, he's not a saint. But in 1455, the Gutenberg Bible was published, and because of the invention of printing, the Scripture became, at first, something that only a very wealthy man could afford, because printing brought it from the realm of a princely object to something that an ordinary rich person could afford. And within a century, anybody could afford a Scripture portion. Within 2 centuries, Bible societies were giving away entire Bibles for free. But knowledge was beginning to leak out about the Bible. And the first line of people who had access to it were scholars. John Wycliffe of England, a Greek scholar at Oxford, one of the most unlikely revolutionaries you could imagine. But instead of using any number of other sources to teach his students Greek, he said, we're going to learn Greek from the New Testament. The what? The New Testament. Read it for yourself. I think that John Wycliffe had noticed that the church was immensely corrupt and not at all like the life of Jesus and the apostles. And he wanted his students to understand this. How better to understand it than to have the same experience that he had? And so then he assigned his students, prepare translations, and you'll know they're good enough when you can read them to the common people in the marketplace and they'll understand you. This is thought to be the origination of a group of lay preachers called the Lollards that eventually were considered extremely subversive and persecuted for their entire course of existence. But a humble Greek teacher started it off. Now, he began to write some scholarly articles, and along these lines he said, what is wrong with the church? It is corrupt. Why is it corrupt? Because of wealth. What is the cure? Take away the wealth of the church. But what do we do with it? Give it to people who are trained to deal with worldly mammon, kings, princes, nobles. Well, the church just went ballistic when they found out that John Wycliffe was saying this sort of thing. And they said, burn him, kill him, silence him. But the nobles of England said, oh, wait a minute, not so fast. this guy makes a sort of sense, doesn't he? Take the wealth in the church, purify it, give it to us. I just don't see the problem here. And so they refused to take away his chair of Greek at Oxford. And even though the pressure became more and more intense, eventually he was forced into house arrest, and then he had a stroke. But he died in bed and not a martyr. Although I should point out that, almost 2 centuries pass. Mary of England comes to the throne. She has John Wycliffe's body dug up, burned at the stake, and then all the pieces left over, powdered and cast into the river Swift, were carried away to the sea, so that there would be no relics of John Wycliffe. And I've always thought, boy, that's the martyrdom for me. Die comfortably in bed surrounded by my loved ones and then have my body burned at the stake. That is an attractive martyrdom to a person of our luxury-loving 21st century era. Well, we get to the 16th century, the morning stars of the Reformation give way to the real stars of the Reformation. And they're only stars because they're people whose names have made such an imprint on the history books that we can't think about their era without thinking of it as being centered around them. But there were countless people like Peter Waldo who achieved his lifelong desire. He surmounted the goals of learning to read, learning Latin, bribing a priest to copy portions of the scripture, and what he read was the same, and then had the same experience as Wycliffe had later. Says, oh my goodness, the church is nothing like the apostles and Jesus. And his friend said, you're very strange, Peter Waldo. He says, no, look, I can teach you too. In time, Peter Waldo became the founder of a church known as the Waldenses, who only survived the martyrdom that their neighbors were certain to dish out for them, as they kept retreating into ever higher portions of the Alps, the French Alps, until eventually the Protestant Reformation kind of happened and they found themselves forerunners. Gee, we didn't even know. Well, the Reformation revolves around some key people. I think Martin Luther was one of the forerunners, and there's a reason why. On your timeline, the little timeline that jumps from the medieval era back to the modern era and starts the modern era, it doesn't line up with 1500. It lines up with 1514. In fact, it lines up with October 31st. 1517, sorry. October 31st, 1517, Reformation Day. We celebrate a Reformation Sunday because that was the day that he hammered or nailed 97 theses, all in one big foolscap document, to the church door or chapel door at the University of Wittenberg, which was a way of inviting formal debate on the subject of indulgences. What is an indulgence? I have to go back to the keys, because the way it worked was you went to the priest, you said your confession, and he said, by the power of Christ and the grace that he accrued by his death on the cross, I remit the eternal penalty of sins, and I assign you this trivial task. It's called the temporal penalty. The trivial task might be go on a pilgrimage, or say 100 Our Fathers and 50 Hail Marys. Or if it was for really serious sins, you have to sell all your property, donate it to the monastery, and join one yourself, okay? Whatever it is, it's nothing compared with what Christ did on the cross to buy our salvation. But that temporal penalty was like the sword of Damocles over your head. And what if you, fully intending to pay your temporal penalty, we're setting off to make the round of the cathedral to say your Our Fathers and Hail Marys, and you tripped over a loose brick and dashed your brains out against one of the columns before it was said. Well, that temporal penalty would doom you to thousands of years in purgatory, which is, has an ending, but it's not nice to be condemned for 100,000 years to purgatory. So the church had this idea of the indulgence. The church has authority because of Peter and the keys. It says, well, we know that he wanted to do it. We'll cancel that. And boom, the soul sprung immediately from purgatory to heaven on the authority of the priest. Well, this idea of indulgences had become a lucrative moneymaker for a series of the three worst popes in history. 1, 2, 3, one after another. What are the odds that you get three such horrible popes? Now, if you're interested in art history or architecture, they're the greatest popes ever because they bankrupted the church for the sake of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, or the vast art treasures of Michelangelo and countless other people of his ilk. No, not that there's countless people of his ilk, but you know, get the idea. They were lovers of art and basically not particularly interested in the spiritual health of the church. Well, Luther and the earnest Germans to the north just found this amazing. When he discovered that the Pope was actually sponsoring this indulgence selling tour in Germany, he went through the roof. And these indulgent salesmen were very clever. They're far smarter than the modern telemarketers, because they'd show up and they'd say, "Good news! Indulgences free from the Pope. Who here has lost a loved one in the last year?" Of course, everybody did. "Your father." "Oh, yes, just a few months ago." "Well, where is he now?" "Well, I hope he's in heaven." "What, he was a saint?" "Well, maybe in purgatory." "Doubtless in purgatory. For another 100,000 years. The pitchforks, the knitting needles through the eyes, the pus streaming. Wouldn't you love to have your father in heaven at this particular exact moment?" "Oh, yes, my lord," or whatever. "Here, this indulgence is free from the Pope for you at this moment." Pooh! His soul springs to heaven. Who else lost a loved one? Of course, the first one was free, but everybody else pays, according to a sliding scale that was later adapted by a sliding scale. Well, Martin Luther was lit on fire by that. His own journey is very significant because he was an extremely earnest monk. He couldn't believe that the Pope would agree to anything like that. It was a long, slow process, including a year of studying the Psalms and then Romans. And in between, he took a visit to Rome where he saw the most worldly and corrupt priests he could imagine, saying 100 masses a day because they got paid for each one. And he got home shaking his head and saying, "Wow, the scriptures are where the truth is, and those Roman priests that I had idolized don't know the first thing about them." Well, the Reformation was built on a rediscovery of the scriptures. And for Martin Luther, it meant a return to New Testament preaching. So in every Lutheran service, a practice that was passed on to virtually all of the Protestant world, there's a reading of the scripture. Ideally, it could be like the Old Testament, the Gospels, and the epistles, or it could just be a simple text on which the minister preaches a sermon of biblical truth. Well, it was revolutionary. There was no homily in the medieval church. There was simply the Mass. The priest could do nothing to add to that. Most priests were so ill-educated they couldn't say anything intelligent beyond going through the motions. And so the new Reformation clergy were far better educated. One of the most brilliant men of his age was John Calvin. Humble scholar, loved the Latin classics. He was a fan of Cicero, converted at the University of Paris, where he yearned to spend all of his life immersed in academia. I was converted as a physics student at Duke University. I know what it was like to kind of go in and have this radical shift in your worldview. He got wrapped up, involved with a circle of revolutionary young Christians who had gotten themselves in trouble with the administration. John Calvin was a fresh face. The administration didn't know about his leanings in the direction of what we now call Protestantism. And his friends urged him to give a hard-hitting, forthright, earnest speech at the opening of the new school year, when he, because of his academic excellence, was assigned the task of doing so. Well, it was so forthright and earnest and hard-hitting that by nightfall, there was a warrant out for his arrest, and he had to sneak out of Paris disguised as a farmer with a hoe slung over his back. Well, he never got to live in Paris and enjoy academia. He settled down ultimately after a brief detour in Strasbourg, where he had a short but happy marriage. And boy, nobody needed a wife more than him. He's one of these eggheads who would forget to eat for 3 days in a row. He'd wear the same clothing until it rotted off his body. He needed a keeper because he was so focused. He was focused on understanding what the Bible really taught and organizing it and simplifying it so that even the nobles of France, because he still viewed himself as a Frenchman in exile, could understand it. So he wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which began as a pamphlet and then grew into the 2 fat 800-page volumes that they are today. It shows his true scholarly instincts. You can't make him stop. Now, a lot of bad things have been said about Calvin. I love Calvin. I am, as some people sometimes say, are you a Calvinist? And I know by the way they say it, they're not meaning it in a good way. And so, well, I'm as much a Calvinist as Calvin was. Oh, so you believe that all these people have been predestined to damnation. Well, Calvin was very uncertain on that. What he was interested in was rescuing the power of God back from the corrupt medieval church. In the corrupt medieval church, God did whatever the priest told him to do, in effect. And God was sovereign. God was in charge. God is the one who engineered salvation, not the priest who breaks the bread. And as far as a tolerant man go, he maintained a correspondence with everyone. Catholics, rich, poor, nobles, humble. A 20-year correspondence with a cardinal, a Catholic cardinal, Cardinal Sadoleto. Now, if Calvin or any of his colleagues set foot in France, they would immediately be arrested and martyred. But Catholics were perfectly safe in Geneva. And one day, on one trip, Cardinal Sadoleto had an opportunity to pass through Geneva on a business trip, and he said, I'm going to look up my pen pal Calvin. And he had the address, and when he was taken there, he said, I can't believe that this is the building, the home of the great John Calvin. And when the door was open, he wrote this to a colleague, which is why we know it. When the door was open, I was staring at the scruffiest, dirtiest, most unkempt servant I've ever seen. I thought, this cannot be a servant in the house of the great John Calvin. And then the servant says, I am John Calvin. Can I help you? It stunned him to see him living in such, humility. But John Calvin took every cent that he could beg, borrow, or force the Geneva government to give him, and he put it into the University of Geneva. He was building the University of Geneva into a hotbed of Reformation theology. And these students, they were not just intellectuals. He would teach them all fall, winter, and spring, and his colleagues, of course, and then send them out on mission trips in the summer. And of course, if you lived in Geneva, the mission was right across the French border. And then after the matriculation in the fall, he would count the empty seats, and he'd know how many martyrs of his students there had been the preceding summer. Well, one of his students was John Knox. Now, John Knox was only born about 8 years after John Calvin, and he was a wholly different kettle of fish. He was a Scotsman to the core. He was as interested in Scottish nationalism as he was in the Reformation of the church in Scotland. And it's probably unfair to put it that way, because you could not reform the church in Scotland unless you dealt with the political situation in Scotland. The tendency of Scottish nobles to to put one of their own on the throne as a corrupt Scottish king, and the relationship between France and Scotland was both enabling and destructive. Well, he got involved in, he was a priest, but then he became a bodyguard for a hot-headed Scottish reformer named Wishart. He bought himself one of those two-handled swords, the claymore, so that he could more effectively be a bodyguard, but eventually captured by the French, condemned to a lifetime of servitude in the galleys, rowing the galleys. I always think of the movie Spartacus, and it probably hadn't changed much in 1,500 years. So, no, we don't know exactly how he got out of his lifetime of servitude, but he spent almost 2 years in the galleys and nearly died on several occasions. But when he came back to Scotland, it was at the right time, at the right place, and he was able to be in a position of huge influence, not only in Scotland, in reforming the church there. By the way, one aspect of that Reformation is getting rid of English bishops. Well, if you replace them with Scottish bishops, what does that do for you? And so the big idea that he brought back from Calvin's Geneva was the idea of the presbytery, the elders. I still have 4 minutes. The church would be run by elders in a hierarchy. Now, this worked so well in Scotland that many of the reformers in England greatly desired to see it implemented there. And when the last of Henry VIII's line died, and King James VI of Scotland was invited to be James I of England, all these Protestant bishops went to him and said, "Sir, let's reform the Church of England along Presbyterian lines." Well, James I said, "Really? Republicanism," which is another word for what we call the Presbyterian system, republicanism has as much in common with monarchy as God does with the devil. No, thank you. And for that reason, although there was a brief period of Presbyterian rule in England, it was during the rule of Cromwell, and then as soon as the Stuart kings came back, it was over. Well, the 17th century, wars of religion. We'll begin here next time, because at the very moment that the unreformed part of Europe was poised to crush the tiny Lutheran states, that was the exact moment that the Turks invaded the West. The siege of Vienna was the high point of 17th century Muslim expansion, and it took the whole attention off the Reformation long enough for the Reformation to coalesce and solidify and survive. Now, when we come back, we'll take a brief few moments to sort of look at the history of the Reformation in England, which led to a religious war where Spain sent a whole armada, the greatest fleet in history up to that time, against England for the sake of winning it back to the Roman see. And then we'll see in France what happened to I always have a hard time pronouncing this correctly, Huguenot of France. Well, thank you so much for sticking with me for Church History in a Hurry. And when we come back, we have only 3 centuries to look at that include our own, many of which have lived through a significant portion of it, me more than half. I'm referring to the 20th century, my century, the good century. Now, if you missed some of these and would like to catch up, you can find a link on the website. There's also a reference to link on the bottom of your notes, and you can go through the first